I'm Victoria, and I remember the day everything changed. I was 7 years old, sitting on our living room floor with my favorite stuffed penguin, when my parents sat me down to explain that they were getting divorced. My father, with his gentle voice and kind eyes, tried to assure me that nothing would change, that I would still be loved just as much. But even at that young age, I knew things would never be the same. The new arrangement meant I lived in 2 different houses. During the week, I stayed with my father in our familiar home, where the walls seemed to radiate warmth and love. Dad would help me with my homework, cook dinner while singing off-key to oldies songs, and always made time to listen to my stories about school. But weekends were different. Those were spent at my mother's house, where the air felt thick with silence and indifference. Mom treated my presence like an inconvenience, barely acknowledging me beyond the absolute necessities. I'd spend those weekends in the sparse bedroom she'd set up for me, drawing pictures or reading books, anything to pass the time until I could return to Dad's. The contrast between my 2 homes couldn't have been starker. At Dad's, my artwork covered the fridge. At Mom's, she wouldn't even hang a single drawing I made for her. The truth was painfully clear: my mother only tolerated these weekend visits because of the alimony checks my father provided. I overheard her phone conversations sometimes, complaining to friends about having to babysit on weekends, but always ending with, "At least the support payments make it worth it." Life continued this way for 7 years. I learned to navigate between these 2 worlds, the warmth of my father's love and the cold indifference of my mother's house. But then came the day that shattered my world completely. I was 14 when the police officers showed up at our door. There had been a car accident, a drunk driver ran a red light. My father, my wonderful, loving father, was gone in an instant. The prospect of living full-time with my mother was unbearable. She made it clear she wasn't thrilled about the idea either, especially now that the alimony payments had stopped. In her eyes, I had become nothing more than a financial burden. Thankfully, my Aunt Sarah, Dad's sister, stepped in. She offered to let me stay with her, and surprisingly, my mother agreed, though she made it clear she wasn't giving up her parental rights. "Just in case," she'd said with a shrug, as if my future was nothing more than an insurance policy. The pain of losing Dad was still there, a constant ache in my chest, but it had become more manageable. Aunt Sarah's home became my sanctuary, a place where I could heal and feel safe. She had Dad's same gentle spirit, and sometimes when she laughed, I could hear echoes of him in her voice. I hadn't heard much from my mother during that time, which was exactly how I preferred it. She'd call occasionally, usually around holidays or my birthday, but our conversations were brief and superficial. That's why I was completely caught off guard when she showed up at Aunt Sarah's doorstep one spring afternoon. "Victoria, honey," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Can we talk?" I remember standing in the doorway, frozen with uncertainty. My mother looked different somehow, more put together, almost glowing. She was wearing an expensive-looking dress and actually had tears in her eyes. "I know I haven't been the best mother," she began, sitting at Aunt Sarah's kitchen table. "But things are different now. I'm different." She went on to tell me about her recent marriage to a successful businessman named Robert. As she spoke, her eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before. Robert, she explained, couldn't have children of his own, but he desperately wanted a family. "He's such a wonderful man, Victoria," she said, reaching for my hand across the table. "He wants us to be a real family. All of us." Then came the catch, the story we'd need to tell. "If Robert asks why you haven't been living with me, just tell him you needed time with your father's family after his death. That you were too grief-stricken to be anywhere else." She squeezed my hand. "He'll understand that." I sat there for a long time after she left, turning the situation over in my mind. Aunt Sarah brought me hot chocolate and sat with me in silence, letting me process everything. After days of internal debate, I made my decision. Maybe people could change. Maybe my mother really had transformed into someone capable of love. And if nothing else, I owed it to myself to find out. Moving into their house was like stepping into another world. Robert turned out to be everything my mother had described and more. He was tall and distinguished looking, with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Over the next few weeks, Robert and I developed an easy friendship. He asked about my interests, my schoolwork, my dreams for the future. He actually listened when I spoke, just like Dad used to do. When I mentioned I loved reading, he converted one of the spare rooms into a small library. When I talked about wanting to learn photography, a professional camera appeared on my desk the next day. Most surprisingly, my mother was playing her part perfectly. She made breakfast every morning, asked about my day, and even started showing up at my school events. She was like a completely different person, attentive, caring, almost maternal. Robert's success meant we wanted for nothing. Shopping trips became regular occurrences, with my mother and me coming home laden with bags from expensive boutiques. My closet filled with designer clothes I never would have dreamed of owning before. But it wasn't the material things that mattered most, it was the way Robert treated us like we were precious, like we were worth every penny and more. The first crack in our perfect family facade appeared about 6 months into my new life with Mom and Robert. His business was expanding, which meant more frequent trips out of town. At first, it was just a few days here and there, normal business stuff, he'd say, kissing Mom goodbye, and giving me a warm hug before heading to the airport. The moment Robert's car would pull away from the driveway, Mom would practically sprint to her bathroom. I'd hear her humming to herself as she spent hours getting ready, emerging with perfectly styled hair and makeup that belonged more on a magazine cover than a stay-at-home wife. "I'm meeting some girlfriends for dinner," she'd say, not quite meeting my eyes. "Don't wait up, honey." The first time I saw her being dropped off at 2 a.m. by a strange man in a sleek black car, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a friend's husband giving her a ride home. Maybe her girlfriends had hired a driver for their night out. But then it happened again. And again. I started keeping track, unable to ignore the pattern emerging. Different cars, different men, but always the same scenario, my mother, giggling like a teenager as she stumbled out of these vehicles, sometimes leaning in for what was definitely not a friendly goodbye kiss. One night, unable to sleep, I stood at my bedroom window, watching and waiting. The familiar headlights appeared around 1 a.m., and this time I was ready. I had borrowed Robert's old digital camera from his study, the one he'd replaced when he bought me my new one. With shaking hands, I captured several clear shots, my mother, pressed against a red sports car, locked in an intimate embrace with a man who was definitely not my stepfather. The final piece of evidence fell into my lap on a rainy Tuesday evening. Mom had come home earlier than usual, obviously tipsy, muttering something about a headache before collapsing on the couch. Her phone, the latest iPhone, another gift from Robert, sat forgotten on the kitchen counter, its screen lighting up every few minutes with new messages. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at that phone, wrestling with my conscience. What I was considering felt wrong, like a violation of privacy. But hadn't she violated something far more sacred by betraying Robert's trust? With trembling fingers, I picked up the phone. Mom never was good with technology, she hadn't even set up a passcode. As I scrolled through her messages, my stomach churned. There were conversations with at least 5 different men, all of them explicit enough to make me blush. They discussed meetups, shared private photos, and made plans for future rendezvous, all while Robert was away working to give us a better life. Working quickly, I forwarded the most damning messages to my email, including timestamps and contact details. As I hit send on the last batch, I heard Mom stirring on the couch. I barely had time to delete the sent emails and return the phone to its exact position before she stumbled into the kitchen for water. 2 years passed in what felt like a blink. I had just turned 17, and life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Robert's business trips remained frequent, and my mother's outings continued, but I'd learned to live with the guilt of keeping her secret. Robert had become more than just a stepfather to me, he was a genuine father figure, someone I trusted and respected deeply. That's why Mom's announcement over breakfast that morning hit like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. "Robert and I are getting divorced," she said casually, as if commenting on the weather. She didn't even look up from her phone as she demolished the family we'd built. Robert sat at the other end of the table, his face a mask of resignation. He looked older somehow, tired in a way I'd never seen before. "We've agreed to handle this amicably," he said, his voice steady but hollow. Your mother and I have a prenuptial agreement that outlines everything. I learned later that the prenup guaranteed my mother $100,000 for the 2 years they'd been married. Robert, ever the gentleman, didn't fight it. He wrote the check without argument, probably just wanting to be done with the whole thing. I actually felt hopeful for a moment. Maybe this was a chance for us to finally bond, to build something real without the pretense of being a perfect family for Robert's sake. I started packing my room, carefully wrapping the gifts Robert had given me over the years, each one a reminder of his kindness. Then came the conversation that would change everything. "Victoria," Mom said, catching me in the hallway one evening. "We need to talk about arrangements." I followed her into the kitchen, still holding the framed photo I'd been wrapping, one of Robert and me at my 16th birthday party. "I'm moving into the new apartment next week," she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Alone?" The word hung in the air between us like poison gas. "What do you mean, alone?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Look, let's be honest here," she said, her voice taking on that cold tone I remembered so well from my childhood. "I never wanted to be a mother. The only reason I played Happy Families was for Robert's benefit. Now that's over, and I don't need you anymore. But where am I supposed to go?" My voice cracked, betraying the tears I was fighting to hold back. She waved her hand dismissively. "Go back to your aunt. She's always had a soft spot for you anyway. I'm sure she'll be thrilled to have her little charity case back. I don't remember much about packing the rest of my things. It's all a blur of tears and shaking hands and trying to breathe through the pain of being discarded yet again. Aunt Sarah came to pick me up the next day, her face tight with anger when she saw my red eyes and trembling lips. But as I sat in her car, watching Robert's house disappear in the side mirror, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, but it was being consumed by something else of rage. Pure, white-hot rage at my mother's callous betrayal. With steady fingers, I dialed Robert's number. He answered on the second ring. "Robert, it's Victoria. I need to talk to you about something important. Something you should know." The coffee shop where I met Robert was nearly empty that afternoon. He was already there when I arrived, looking somehow both impeccable and exhausted in his business suit. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out my laptop and opened my email account. "Before I show you this," I said, my mouth dry, "I want you to know that I've been carrying this secret for a long time. I should have told you sooner." His eyes narrowed as he began to read. I watched his expression change as he scrolled through email after email, looked at picture after picture. The muscle in his jaw tightened, but otherwise, he remained perfectly still. "There's more," I said quietly, pulling up the photos I'd taken from my bedroom window. I started documenting everything when I first noticed what was happening. For what felt like hours, Robert sat there, methodically going through every piece of evidence. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "Thank you, Victoria," he said, his voice steady but tight. This changes everything." The prenup had a very specific clause about infidelity. She wasn't entitled to a penny if she was unfaithful during our marriage. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to his lawyer, speaking in clipped, professional tones about immediate legal action to recover the $100,000. "She'll have to return every cent," he said after hanging up. "I'll make sure of it." I nodded, feeling simultaneously vindicated and guilty. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "Don't be," he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing, even if the timing wasn't perfect." The storm hit 3 days later. I was doing homework in my room at Aunt Sarah's when I heard the screeching of tires in the driveway, followed by furious pounding on the front door. "Victoria." My mother's voice was nearly unrecognizable with rage. "I know you're in there." I crept to the top of the stairs, watching as Aunt Sarah opened the door, keeping the security chain latched. "How dare you?" Mom was screaming, her face contorted with fury. "You little snake. Do you know what you've done? He's demanding all the money back. Every penny. How could you do this to your own mother? Leave. Now." Aunt Sarah's voice was steel. before I call the police. But that was just the beginning. The texts started coming first, hundreds of them from different numbers, each more threatening than the last. When I blocked those, the emails began, flooding my inbox from dozens of newly created accounts. You ungrateful little bastard. You've ruined everything. I should have gotten rid of you years ago. I deleted and blocked each one, but they kept coming. Then she started showing up everywhere, outside my school, at the mall where I worked part-time, parked across the street from Aunt Sarah's house. I started varying my routes to school, having friends walk with me to my car, checking over my shoulder constantly. But still she persisted. Every time I thought it was over, she'd find a new way to reach me. A new email address. A new burner phone. A new place to ambush me. I lay awake at night, jumping at every sound, wondering if she was out there in the dark, watching. Aunt Sarah tried to help, but how do you hide from someone who's known you your entire life? Someone who knows all your habits, your schedules, your favorite places? It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was hurrying to my car after school, keys clutched in my hand like a weapon, when I heard her voice. Victoria, please. Just 5 minutes. She was standing by my car, looking nothing like the polished woman who'd lived in Robert's house. Her designer clothes had been replaced by worn jeans and a plain sweater. The perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Even her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. My first instinct was to run, but something in her appearance made me pause. Maybe it was time to end this, one way or another. 5 minutes, I said. In public. We walked to a busy cafe near the school. I chose a table near the window, in full view of the street. My hands shook slightly as I ordered coffee, but my voice remained steady. Talk. You've ruined my life, she began, her voice cracking. Do you understand that? Everything I built, everything I worked for, gone. I almost laughed. Everything you worked for? You mean everything you scammed from Robert? You don't understand, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. I'm facing court proceedings. Robert's lawyers are ruthless. They're going to take everything. And the money. I've already spent it. That's not my problem. But it could be your solution, her eyes took on a calculating gleam. All you have to do is tell Robert you made it all up. Say you photoshopped those pictures, faked those messages. Tell him you did it because you were angry about the divorce. I stared at her, amazed by her audacity. Then an idea struck me, a way to end this permanently. Okay, I said slowly, watching her face light up. I'll do it, on one condition. Anything, honey. Whatever you want. Sign away your parental rights. Let Aunt Sarah adopt me. The words hung in the air between us. I expected hesitation, maybe even outrage. What I didn't expect was the speed with which her face cleared, the way her shoulders relaxed. That's all, she asked, relief evident in her voice. Just sign some papers? Something inside me cracked a little at her eagerness. Even now, even when she needed something from me, the thought of giving me up made her happy. We set up the meeting with the lawyers. Throughout the whole process, I kept waiting to feel something, sadness, regret, anything. But watching her sign away her rights to me with a smile on her face only confirmed what I'd known all along. I'd never really had a mother, just someone who'd been forced to play the role. As she put down the pen after the final signature, she looked lighter, almost giddy. I'll have my lawyer draw up a statement about what you should tell Robert, she said, gathering her things. We can meet tomorrow to go over it. The day after signing away her parental rights, my mother called repeatedly, wanting to meet and go over the statement she'd prepared about Robert. I let it go to voicemail each time, a small smile playing on my lips as I imagined her growing frustration. Finally, I texted her to meet me at the same cafe as before. When I walked in, she was already there, a folder of papers laid out in front of her. I've outlined everything you need to say, she began immediately, pushing the papers toward me. Just follow this script, Anne. I'm not going to lie to Robert, I cut her off, pulling out my phone and placing it on the table. Her face froze. What? Remember our last conversation here? I pressed play on my phone, and her voice filled the space between us. All you have to do is tell Robert you made it all up. Say you photoshopped those pictures, faked those messages. The color drained from her face. You recorded me? Every word, I said calmly. Including the part where you admitted to spending money you obtained through fraud. You manipulative little, she sputtered, her face contorting with rage. I learned from the best, I cut her off again. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop harassing me. Stop calling, stop emailing, stop showing up at my school and Aunt Sarah's house. If you don't, this recording goes public. Every relative, every friend, everyone who thinks you're the victim in this situation will hear exactly who you really are. She stood up so violently her chair toppled backward. Several cafe patrons turned to stare as she started screaming. You ungrateful bastard. After everything I've done for you. Everything you've done? I stayed seated, kept my voice level. You mean abandoning me? Using me? Trading me away for money? Those things? Later that day, I called Robert. He listened quietly as I explained everything that had happened, including my mother's attempt to make me lie for her. I'll have my lawyer draw up a restraining order right away, he said without hesitation. She's gone too far. The next time my mother showed up at Aunt Sarah's house, I was ready. I opened the door just enough to hand her the legal documents. The next time you come near me, I said, I'll file this restraining order. And then I'll release the recording. Your choice. She read through the papers, her hands shaking. For a moment, she looked like she might start screaming again. Instead, she crumpled the papers in her fist and stormed off. That was the last time I saw her in person. Robert told me a few months later that she'd started making payments to return the money, small amounts, but regular. I didn't ask where she got it from. I didn't care. Through the grapevine, I heard she'd moved to Arizona or maybe New Mexico. It didn't matter. She'd finally done what she'd wanted to do all along, she'd disappeared from my life completely. The day Aunt Sarah's adoption of me became official, we celebrated with a small dinner, just the three of us, Aunt Sarah, Robert, and me. Looking around that table, I realized something important. Family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you without conditions or ulterior motives. High school graduation came faster than I expected. I sat in my cap and gown, scanning the audience until I found them, Aunt Sarah wiping tears from her eyes, and Robert sitting next to her, beaming with pride. They were the only family I needed in those bleachers. I'd been worried about college. Aunt Sarah worked hard as a teacher, but I knew she couldn't afford tuition. I'd started looking into scholarships and student loans, resigned to the fact that my dreams of higher education might have to wait. Then one evening, Robert asked me to meet him for dinner. I've been thinking, he said, after we'd ordered. You're graduating soon, and we should talk about your future. He pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was a check, enough to cover 4 years at our state university. I burst into tears right there in the restaurant, probably making quite a scene, but I didn't care. The state university wasn't an Ivy League school, but it had a great program in my field, and more importantly, it meant I could get an education without drowning in debt. I threw myself into my studies, determined to prove his faith in me wasn't misplaced. Every time I aced a test or made the dean's list, I'd call him to share the news. He always answered, always listened, always cared. Last week, over coffee, he mentioned something that touched me deeply. You know, he said, stirring his cappuccino, when you graduate, there's always a place for you at the company if you want it. No pressure, but the offer's there. I thanked him, genuinely moved by the offer. It's not just about the job, it's about having someone in your corner, someone who wants to see you succeed. My friends sometimes ask if I miss having a normal family. I usually just laugh. What's normal anyway? I have an aunt who loves me enough to have chosen me as her daughter, who sits up with me when I'm stressed about exams and sends me care packages full of my favorite snacks. I have a stepfather who didn't let our connection end with his marriage to my mother, who still checks in regularly and treats me like his own daughter. Life isn't perfect, college is challenging, the future is uncertain, and yes, sometimes I still have trust issues from everything that happened. But when I look at where I am now, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me, I can honestly say I'm happy.